Hi, welcome to the Joeveo podcast. One reason why I like to have the volume low is because you do have moments where you talk rather loudly. Not you specifically, but just in general, people get excited when they're talking about things.
About Joeveo in particular.
Joeveo in particular, yeah. So welcome to the Joeveo podcast, where a father and son just discuss really just about anything that pops into their head that they find interesting. Typically tends to slant science-based just because, well, we're both science-minded. But also coffee drinkers. That's like a small part of this podcast. So actually, before we get into things, what coffee did you actually use this time? Because I didn't even ask you that before.
So last time we were drinking a single country origin coffee, which was from Panama.
Panamanian.
Right. Pandemonium coffee.
Okay.
And this time it's the same deal, but this time it's from Kenya. So a different continent. And tastes pretty good, actually. I like drinking it iced like this.
Yeah.
I really taste the actual unique flavors of this coffee.
Yeah, I have to admit, I never really drank iced coffee until I moved to Baltimore. And then it seems kind of strange to have hot coffee in summer. Like, 95 degrees outside. It's kind of weird to ask for. Well, I usually get an Americano, as I said last time. But getting an Americano that's hot when it's 95 degrees is a little strange. I started getting into iced coffees. This is good, yeah, for sure. Kenyan coffee. Do you remember the name of it?
No, it's just kind of a store brand Kenyan. Medium roast.
Medium roast tends to have higher caffeine content from the little I know about coffee. I don't. Coffee roasters just went ballistic in their head.
So the more it's roasted, the more caffeine there is?
I don't know anything about roasting. I don't know anything about coffee whatsoever. I just know this is pretty good.
So we're perfect to teach you all there is to know about coffee.
Yeah, we're just going to tell you in really basic terms if we like it or if we don't. So Kenyan iced coffee gets my seal of approval. Yeah.
It's good.
Okay, so aside from coffee, we do actually talk about the main thing we actually really talk about is really just anything that's on our mind. So you wanted to mention something because we had talked about like physics and things of that nature last episode, which was really interesting. I really enjoyed that quite a lot. We talked about structural biology and physics, and then we specifically talked about like quantum physics. And you mentioned that you wanted to talk about that again real quick.
All right, so I don't remember what the question was exactly last time, but somehow we got talking about, I guess, what is quantum physics, and talking about the origins of quantum physics, and which date back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I spoke of the Rutherford experiment as an example of early quantum physical investigation, but actually that was the wrong experiment. So what Rutherford did was shoot a stream of alpha particles at a thin gold foil and noticed that some of those particles went straight through the foil and some of them bounced off, and he used that information through what must have been very tedious long observations of the bouncing off particles by the researchers who actually did the work in the laboratory for him.
Like the postdocs, the PhD students, the grunts.
Nowadays that would be the case, yeah, but I think these guys were actually physicists themselves and just not quite as elevated as Rutherford himself was the director of the laboratory. This was in England. And so Rutherford actually analyzed the data, and from that he deduced the size of the nucleus of the atom, and actually this is how we learned something very basic and very important about the structure of atoms, that they're composed of a very small, dense nucleus, and these nuclei in, for example, this gold foil are very widely spaced. So each atom or each atomic realm occupied by a nucleus is surrounded by a huge, in relative terms, space of empty space. And we didn't know that until then. So that's what we learned from that experiment, is something about the structure of the atom, and that they're actually very widely spaced, even in a solid.
So the only thing that I can relate this to is like the different molecules that make up, well, going to what you said, like in a solid, things in chemistry, we talk about how things that are closely packed together are solid form. They're slightly further apart, they're liquid form, and then the most like distance they are between different molecules, that's a gaseous state. Is that roughly what you're talking about? I mean, I know you're talking about on an atomic level, which is different from a molecular level. Atomic level, as my understanding, is lower. It makes up molecules themselves. So that I always understood that on a molecular level. That makes sense, because you've got, like, if you just have molecules that are more spread out, then you won't be able to see them. And if they're more dense together, then you can actually touch them and actually do stuff to them. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around the idea of atoms being separated out. So what's within that space then? Nothingness?
Well, that's where it starts getting tricky. I mean, according to the basic, I guess, the Bohr model of the atom, I think as it's called, you've got this very dense nucleus composed of protons and neutrons, and then around that nucleus there are these electrons flying. So you've got this cloud of electrons around a very dense nucleus, and electrons have practically no mass compared to the other components of the atom.
Doesn't there have to be a point at which you have zero distance, like between anything? And I don't know what that structure would be. I don't know what that particle would be, whatever you would describe it as. But there has to be something, because if you think of air, you're still thinking of, is air just like nothingness with molecules in it, or is it, okay. So you're saying yes. You're nodding yes. Okay, so that's something I didn't fully understand. I guess I never really considered it all that much. It's not like I'm sitting around thinking about air. But if I did think about air, there would have to be, if there's a potential, or at least what I thought was that air is something always, and it's just made up of varying particles, but which is true to a degree. It's just that there's space between those particles.
Yeah, and even that is just a matter of scale, because if you take a cubic millimeter of air, you've probably got, I don't know, 1 billion molecules in there, or diatomic molecules of nitrogen and oxygen mostly. So there are a lot of particles in that, in a very small space, and in the air that you're breathing. But if you look at it, if you magnify that millimeter cube, or keep going down, you'll see that there are vast distances between the molecules of air, even at that density.
And that's where I have difficulty. Like I can think about molecules, that I can get down to the molecular level, but for me, getting anywhere beyond that, getting to the atomic level, like I was always tripped up by like elements, for example, right, on the periodic table. I always thought it was weird that we would describe something as an atom when in reality it was like X amount of atoms, right, make up a particular element, right? Something along those lines.
No, not necessarily. I mean, an element is a particular atom with a particular number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and the same number of, or half the number of electrons in the electron cloud. So each element has its own atomic configuration, its own atom. And that's what distinguishes the different elements. So a block of gold, for example, that's just atoms of gold, and they're just in a mass.
So we just describe elements. Why do we even use the word element then? Seems like we could just use the word atom of gold,
We could, yeah. But probably the concept of elements predated the concept of atoms. Or I guess it didn't, because the concept of atoms goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers, I believe. But something like that.
Yeah, so this might be a situation in which we need to just
Wikipedia
get rid of
would be.
we just need to get rid of one of them. Yeah, and Wikipedia might help for sure. But actually, I think that's kind of what makes things fun when it comes to like podcasting in general. Is just like sometimes you don't look things up. Like in the 21st century now, we can essentially look up anything. I mean, within to a certain point. And a lot of podcasts, they do just start like researching stuff to like figure out what they got right, what they got wrong, mid podcast, and maybe we'll do that in the future. But yeah, like just kind of speculating on something can be pretty interesting. Yeah. So essentially what we could get rid of one or the other, and most likely we'd get rid of element and keep atom then if we wanted to describe physics or chemistry.
I think you could use either, yeah.
Yeah.
It would probably be less confusing for beginning chemistry students.
Yeah, it was a source of extreme confusion for me. Granted, I didn't really care about chemistry at the time. Now I'm getting far, far more interested in it. But that's actually something that's true in biology too. You have particular terms that were termed in like the 1800s or something, and then somewhere along the way we were like, we're going to change it. We don't want to call it that anymore. As a matter of fact, I was talking with my friend Alec yesterday, recording a podcast for Physionic, and during that podcast we kept referencing a particular molecule which is called AKT. So it's called AKT, but now it's being rebranded as PKB. And they are the exact same thing. So in papers, when you're reading it, you have to know AKT equals PKB.
Uh-huh.
It's ridiculous because there's like they're essentially figuring out how they're going to name different things, right? So
I don't envy them.
Yeah, I mean it's
naming all these chemicals.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It's some of it is just stupid. Like some of the researchers are just. They get like an ego. I don't know if there's like a regulating body that has to approve particular names. I imagine there might be or you come out with a name and everybody's like, yeah, we're not going to use that. and then they end up using something completely different. I mean, researchers like to get a little geeky when it comes to if they discover a molecule, they're like red fire, and there are molecule names that like they
Except
figured
they say
out,
it in Latin.
Yeah, they figured out like an acronym for fire, like whatever it is, which is but that kind of falls into that whole like element and atom thing. Like you have to know that they're one and the same, and you could use the terms interchangeably. And when I was going through chemistry, nobody could seem to just say it like that. They're the same thing. But then granted, I would have had a conniption fit and I would have been like, what? Knowing myself, I would have just been so angry and been like, pick one.
Okay, I'm done with this.
Yeah,
what else could I do?
Just tell the professor, you need to pick one right now and call it that from now on. Oh, man. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I had something I wanted to ask you. Wait
a minute, we didn't finish talking about my thing.
Okay, what else did you want to say?
Okay, so that was Rutherford, and the actual experiments that led to the foundation or the creation of quantum theory was experiments done by a number of different researchers, apparently, on the photoelectric effect. And I don't know, we don't really have time for me to describe that now, but these experiments were done in laboratories, and people had been noticing the strange, inexplicable behavior of nature in these experiments. And it was Einstein, I think, who actually said this all makes total sense if we hypothesize that light has this quantum characteristic to it, so it doesn't exist on a continuum of energy levels, but each different wavelength of light has a particular amount of energy associated with its photons. So that's where the point in time, which was also at the beginning of the 20th century, like 1908 or 1910 or something like that, where just they had these strange results in the laboratory, and we needed quantum physics to explain them. And that's, I guess, what set off the whole field of quantum physics.
Because there are different iterations of physics. Clearly, I don't know anything about physics, really. So, Newton, right, was kind of at least one of the fathers of physics.
Mm-hmm.
And he had kind of a look at the world kind of approach. Like, it wasn't down to the subatomic level. It was more of, there's a term for it from, I remember in Bronowski, I think that's Bronowski, yeah. He has a documentary series where he talks about like science in general, and one of the things is obviously on physics, because you can't forget about physics. And he talks about how Newton was one of the fathers, but it was a physics that explained a lot of the world, but it didn't explain everything in the world. So that last like 10% or 20% he couldn't explain. And that's where some of these other iterations of physics that kind of evolved over time, like I'm assuming the discovery of the atom, and then now like subatomic and quantum physics, I'm assuming that's one of those other iterations of physics that came out.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. I don't know if Newton ever observed any phenomena that couldn't be described or explained by his kind of macroscopic physical theories. But when it came to the beginning of the 20th century, researchers were doing experiments in the laboratory that just couldn't be explained anymore with Newtonian physics. So that is kind of what set off the quantum physics revolution.
Started by Einstein.
Well, Einstein and a bunch of other physicists who were working on the same problems at that time.
I guess this was what, in like the 1930s?
No, it was like early 1900s, like 1910 to 1915, I think, something like that.
Right, you mentioned that. Huh. Yeah, it's quite something. In that situation, like when you run into a roadblock like that for somebody who's studying physics at that time, if you're telling people, science can explain all these different things, and then you run into this roadblock of suddenly science doesn't make any sense. I wonder if any of them had any like mini panic attacks, like, oh no, there's some stuff here that we just can't explain whatsoever. And then Einstein comes swooping in and explains the situation away.
That must have been a really unreal time to be a physicist. Imagine the paper that where these experimentalists describe what they're seeing in the laboratory, and it can't be accounted for. You know, oh, there's something going on here that we don't understand,
Yeah.
and we have no idea how to explain it.
Right.
So did we do it wrong, you know? Does a paper get published? Because maybe it wouldn't, because somebody will say, well, you obviously screwed something up somewhere, because this makes no sense.
Yeah, which is kind of an interesting distinction between biology and physics to a degree. And we talked about this last time, but like physics and mathematics are fields that are very much like we've created something literally out of nothing to explain the world, and it does such a good job at explaining the world. It gives us order, it gives us an understanding, it gives us a platform essentially then to build other things off of, which is crazy. But I do wonder if maybe there are alternative ways of creating that platform that maybe aren't as good or maybe are better or whatever it might be, because a lot of this stuff is just thought about, right? You just think about it, and I mentioned this last time, that it's just observation after observation, not just from a single person, but from thousands of people that continue to observe the same phenomenon over and over and over again. And then they just kind of integrate that and then add that to kind of their overall understanding of the world. I wonder if it is possible to think about another form of science, or not even maybe science, where it's not called physics, it's not called mathematics, and this is really abstract, but like if somehow art became some form of expression that wasn't just a form of expression in terms of like a cultural way, but also became like a platform with which we could build off of and kind of go from there. It seems kind of strange to think about because mathematics are so rigid and that's what makes them so great, because 5 + 5 is always 10, and it just goes from there. It just builds and builds and builds and builds, like all these different theories just build on one another, and then it just creates this like incredible world that we live in. It's something to think about.
It creates a model for the incredible world that we live in.
Yeah.
A model that works and helps us understand it, and helps us predict what will happen in different circumstances.
Yeah, and for some reason, I've never really understood this either, but people keep saying, oh, that's like certain things are never going to be possible. Moving at the speed of light, for example. I'm just throwing something out there because I don't know. But people say that, and then it seems like physics and mathematics keeps breaking those predictions of the future. And maybe right now we still believe, of course, that we can't move at the speed of light or faster than the speed of light or whatever it might be. But it seems like regardless, we just keep pushing forward. It's like our brain for certain individuals is like, once you get this base of understanding of physics and mathematics, suddenly you have the weapons at your disposal, like the raw material there to be able to start attacking some of these problems from all these different angles. And if you have enough human minds working at a problem like that it might actually be possible to be able to do some of the things that we've said on an individual level that we can't.
I wonder. We were talking about teleportation last time, and that's something that seemed like it, I guess, must be impossible years ago, but now they apparently have done it for information anyway. I mean, transmitting information instantaneously instead of being limited by the speed of light. So
yeah,
that's an example.
What a limitation that is, the speed of light.
Well, sometimes you just need to go faster.
Yeah. And And it's just a realm that I know nothing about. Like I'm not even a student, I'm just an ignorant idiot, when it comes to that, which is just to speak on that for a second. It's kind of nice to be an idiot every once in a while. Like, not that I'm like a brainiac, but I'm just saying, like, being an idiot in particular areas is a nice relief sometimes, to talk about something you know nothing about, so that you can forgive yourself for being that stupid about something, just so you can learn and like be fascinated by something else, even if you're never going to be an expert in that field. And physics, I think, is one of those things that I think is really interesting, but I would never want to devote my career, my life to understand it. But it does bring about all these like really interesting questions, at least to me, interesting to me, in terms of like what's possible, what we can do with the amazing field of physics and mathematics.
Well, I mean, I could say the same about biology, for example. I know basically nothing about biology, but physics actually underlies everything in our lives, including biology. And I think there are approaches to chemistry and biology that go all the way down to the first physical principles and to explain biological processes, aren't there?
Oh,
or to explain chemical reactions. And
100%. Yeah, definitely. Like how we exchange different ions, for example, or like the electrical principles of the neuron are explained, which I think is a terrible idea, but some people seem to really click with the idea of understanding it from like a physical and more electrical engineering style of understanding the neuron. I don't think that way at all, so it doesn't work for me. But yeah, a lot of things are explained in biology using basic physics principles. Yeah. So is that what you wanted to say?
So that's something I don't know anything about. Oh, you want to move on to your questions?
I just had one.
Go ahead. I'm waiting with bated breath here.
Well, I have a series of questions, but I'm just going to limit it to one because.
So this seems to be part of our podcast thing, is where Nick springs questions on his father without giving him any time for preparation. So he says dumb things about Rutherford and the photoelectric effect, and
it's pretty accurate. Well, I only have like 10 more minutes before I have to go because my friends from Baltimore are coming. They're going to get here in 20 minutes. So.
Well, we'll talk. We can broach the subject and then actually talk about it next time. That could also be part of this podcast. Is
just a continuation. Always leave a morsel for next time.
Right, like
just to pick it up.
A starter piece of starter dough for your sourdough.
Right. So my only question is something that you've practiced in before, but meditation. So I don't know where I was listening to. I think it was either I was reading it in a book or I was listening to some podcast, and they were talking about meditation, right? So it's a really simple question, like, what do you think meditation is? And there were two different avenues that they went down. One is the clearing of your mind. That's one type of meditation, according to them. Whoever it is, I don't remember. The other one is when something I hadn't really considered is just being with yourself, letting your mind control where your thoughts go. Like, not distracting yourself with anything and just seeing where your mind goes, like how it organizes itself, essentially. What do you think?
Well, I think there's more to it than that. I mean, people talk about guided meditation too, as a kind of meditation where someone outside of you suggests things for you to do with your mind. And the kind of meditation that I practice and seems to work for me is the mind clearing type. But when you're doing that, unless you're really a master, your mind is actually constantly bringing up thoughts, and you are trained to observe those thoughts and let them go. So I don't know if that's what you're talking about for the second kind of meditation.
Well, it could be, yeah. I mean, I don't think they really had anything specifically in mind. They didn't go into it that much, but it was curious for me because I had thought, because of previous conversation we'd had before, that meditation was more about clearing the mind. But we'd also talked about how incredibly difficult that is. That's essentially, it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, to completely clear your mind of all thoughts. And I like the idea, if that's meditation or not, but I like the idea. I think more people in general should be doing this, although it's kind of dangerous, I think, to just sit down and let your mind take you wherever it needs to take you. I mean, sometimes that could be in a terrible direction, which is scary. I mean, because then essentially you're allowing yourself not to numb yourself with TV or not numb yourself with music or whatever it is, but actually just sit in silence and let your mind take you to wherever it needs to take you. And a lot of that, I'm sure, is influenced by what you're going through in that situation. So you probably have to be pretty mindful of the environment that you're in, but also your past experiences, your recent past experiences. But I found, at least for myself, because it's something I've done a few times, my mind tends to get really creative. It starts to get really excited about other things. And what I find really interesting about that is that some people can't do that, right? Which is something I thought about. Some people suffer from depression, for example. I don't know. I've never been depressed. I've never gone through that before. So I can't really say for someone, but I imagine, just my intuition is, that if you are depressed and you try and go through some sort of meditation in that mindset, mentality of you're just trying to organize your thoughts, those thoughts probably tend more towards negative. Like they don't, maybe it can be a benefit because maybe they'll organize their negative thoughts and like figure out how to attack each one, but maybe that's not even the role of meditation. I don't know. It's just, it's just got me thinking about like what meditation is and how it can be beneficial for different people based on the definition that you use. Like for some people, clearing their mind, and for other individuals, it's organizing their thoughts, and for other individuals, it's a really terrifying idea to let your mind take you to the place that it needs to go, because it can be just powerfully emotional. It just puts you in a bad place. Or alternatively, if you're in a great place, like you don't have very many worries, then it can take you to some really fantastic places. And it's funny though, I've had my mind take me places. I'm sure other people have experienced this too. Like you just think of something that happened like 6 years ago, like some tiny moment, and you relive it, which is so strange to me, like why your brain would take you to that point. And sometimes it's like an incredibly embarrassing experience, or you felt embarrassed at that time, and you're just like reliving it. And I've had this thought of like, why? Why is this here? Why am I going through this feeling of embarrassment again? But clearly it latched in, right? It like just stuck there. And I don't know if maybe that's part of like the letting go process. Like you think about it and then you have to find ways of like not escaping it, but just letting it go. I don't know, because I've never gone through that whole like letting go process.
Yeah, that the mind does have a way of latching onto the embarrassing moments in your past life. My personal theory on that is just because you relive that so often,
Mm-hmm.
because just after it happened, you probably are reliving it to think, what could I have done better in this situation? What should I have done that I didn't do, or what should I have not done that I did do? And so you're thinking about that, and then the next day you'll think about it again, and so much thinking about it just anchors it in your mind, and there it is 20 years later.
Still haunting
If you want to review all the embarrassing moments in your life, they're right there in that part of your library. Just pull it off the shelf.
Yeah. But it's a funny distinction between, like in psychology, like the subconscious and the conscious, or conscious and subconscious. Subconscious suddenly comes blasting forward when you let it, right? And it's just like, hey, you remember this? And your conscious is just like, why? Why am I here?
Leave me alone. I've got things to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've got more things to say on the topic. Maybe we can leave that for next time. But I think it made me thoughtful. It made me think about, how meditation could, however you define that, like how that can present itself for different individuals when they say, yeah, I meditate for 15 minutes or an hour or whatever it is. Like, and I know for me, time can fly when you're, to me, my definition of meditation at this point, which is more of like letting your mind take you wherever it needs to. You will, I mean, it's not like you're conscious of time. It's not like you're sitting there like, okay, 5 more minutes. It's not like you're trying to really just let go of at least that, like the burden of time and other things, to free up your mind to be able to do that. But when it does, it takes you on this wild journey sometimes. And sometimes it's fantastic, and other times I'm sure it can be incredibly embarrassing, and other times it can be scary, where it takes you. You can really shift your emotions from this like, oh, I'm relatively neutral, to this is terrible. Like my emotions are wrecked,
Yeah.
And you do look at the time after a while and you're like, wow, like an hour went by. That felt like 7 minutes, because you're just so in your own head. It's crazy. Yeah. So anything to add to that?
Well, you should try the mind emptying kind of meditation.
I probably need some help on that. But I mean, I'd totally be game. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really feels good to give your mind a rest.
I don't know.
Believe me. And what's surprising too is you can meditate for 15 minutes or an hour or whatever, and then go back to your normal life, and you notice that your mind has been changed by that 15 minutes or an hour of meditation. Just you see the world in a different way, and your mind remains in a different state for some time after the actual meditation is done. So that something is happening there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And even my definition, you definitely come out of it, the other side, different. And it persists for sometimes negative, sometimes positive. But I imagine with that, you would hope most likely it'd be more positive, or at least just a change in general. It doesn't have to be positive or negative, just neutral, just a change, a shift in mindset. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd be game to try it. I have no problem doing that. Okay. Well, that's what I've got. If you got anything else, otherwise.
I think we did pretty good for two people who didn't know what they were going to talk about.
Hey, I had several things I could have talked about. Like I was going to open up with talking about the new Tool song.
Oh, who's that?
Yeah, did you listen to that?
I haven't listened to it yet.
Oh,
No.
man. They're back. After 13 years.
For the most of you who don't know what Tool is, it's a rock band.
This generation's best rock band. Yes, it's better than Nirvana. Anyways, I'm not going to get ranting on Tool. But, yeah, so that's it. That's what we've got for you for this time around. And till next time, have a good one, guys.
It's been fun.